For today's talk, it's my pleasure to welcome Sylvia Perry, who's going to be talking to us today. Sylvia has some really amazing research. It's kind of hard to put her in a box, other than a box of like excellence. She's, fellows of CESP and APS and won Best Paper Awards and the Sage Young Scholar Award. But I would really characterize Sylvia's research as saying how different people navigate the complexities and challenges of kind of modern social life that's filled with all sorts of ambiguities about other people and social divisions. And I am very excited to hear her talk today, especially because I have a couple kids and really want to know how I should be talking to them about race. And Sylvia is going to give us a really easy synopsis of how to do that, so we won't have any kind of social conflict with our children anymore, and be super easy. Sylvia is also, I know, a superstar parent because we often talk about parenting, and her house, if you miss this, her house actually looks like my Zoom background, where in reality my Zoom background is an elliptical and a pile of discarded toys. So we are excited to have Sylvia here today. And as usual, we will let Sylvia, the speaker, kind of dictate her term, so we can wait till the end. We can ask questions as we go, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with clarification questions throughout. Maybe hold some of the substantive questions toward the end, just because it helps me with pacing. Also, Kurt, I think that I've been very strategic about the corners of our house that I show you. So there's a stationary bike and piles of toys and places that I don't photograph. All right, well, I'm really excited to share this work with you today. Go ahead and get started.
Is it a stationary bike or a Peloton?
That.
Yeah, all right, one of those.
Yeah, one of those. Totally worth the investment, right? Always. Okay, yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to discussing this work with you all today. I'm just going to start with a little bit of an anecdote. So several years ago on Twitter, a South Asian American mom shared some information about an experience she had witnessed with her child on the playground. And this particular story was shared in my academic mamas group, which I'm a part of. So in this story, she talked about her child, who she described as brown, as interacting with other children on the playground. Her kid was about 5, and she witnessed 2 blonde-haired white children go up to her child and basically say something to the effect of, "You can't play with us because you're brown." And one of the things that she sat and observed was the fact that the parents of the white children who were standing nearby looked on, but did not engage with their children or say anything to them. And so, she basically looked over, she's like, there are multiple moms, they seem like they're hanging out, they seem like they're observing the situation, but they're not actually intervening or saying anything to their children. So she felt like her child was sort of left to fend for herself in some ways. Obviously, she could have stepped in, but she just wanted to stand back and see what happened. And her child basically expressed to the children that she wasn't interested in playing with them either because they weren't being very nice to her. And after that, the mom explained how she had a conversation with her child about the fact that some children might not treat her very nicely because of the color of her skin, but that it had nothing to do with her as a person, right? Sort of to affirm her as an individual. And what we know from the literature is that there's a lot of evidence that Black and brown parents or people who identify that way often sort of prepare their children for racism and discuss racism with them in order to sort of buffer them from the realities of this. However, in contrast, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that white parents aren't as likely to do this. So on average, self-reports of research show that very few white parents tend to say they discuss race and racism with their children. And in previous in-lab experiments in which researchers had attempted to get parents to have these discussions, the rates were quite low as 5%. So despite the fact that these discussions are low, there is some evidence to suggest that many parents believe that it is something they should be doing and it's something that would be positive. However, they have these fears that they'll mess it up, they don't know what they're doing, and perhaps they'll make it even worse if they attempt to. And again, these are sort of well-meaning parents, right, who think that this is a good thing and that they should be engaging with their child in an anti-racist way. And so in some of my more recent research, what I and my collaborators have been working on is we want to understand how white parents currently discuss race and racism with their children. We want to examine how these discussions shape children's racial biases and other outcomes. And we're attempting to apply this knowledge in experimental interventions. And so I'm going to share sort of different components of these questions with you today. So in some of our more recent studies in which we've sort of just looked at the content of what parents are talking about, in particular, we were interested in recent current events. So one of our studies published in 2019 was specifically looking at the Charleston shooting, the Black Lives Matter movement, the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and Michael Brown. We were interested in whether parents were having conversations about these current events and what they looked like. And we actually have a current paper that's under review that sort of updated those findings to look at more recent social events that have happened. So in this sample of 168 white parents of white children between the ages of 8 and 12, which is basically an age that research has suggested is particularly well suited for these kinds of conversations that I'm going to talk about. We asked parents if they discussed recent events related to race and racism with their children, and if they witnessed an act of prejudice with their child, how they would respond. We found that consistent with previous research, a little over a third of parents said they were having some sort of discussion with their children in these self-reports. And when we looked at the content of these discussions, basically asking parents what kinds of things that they say, they broke down into two broad categories that are consistent with what the literature tends to show. So a more color conscious kind of conversation, which is the larger paragraph on the left. People a lot of times think that Black people are criminals or drug users or just bad people just because they look different, and that causes hate. And good people and even kids can be hurt or killed because white people are hateful and afraid. So this parent is really talking about a discussion in which they're confronting the realities of racism and the existence of stereotypes. In contrast, there's a parent who says, I try not to teach her not to see color, or that race should not matter, who in the literature would be sort of, sorry, there's my dog, categorized as a parent engaging in colorblind methods of socialization. And then there's a parent who's just sort of avoidant, doesn't think it's relevant. I have not, why would I bring that up, right? And so when we looked at the 2/3 of parents roughly who were not having discussions, what we found is that parents said things like they were waiting for their child to bring it up. They viewed race as irrelevant, and they wanted to shield their child from the realities of racism. And that was actually the most common way that they said they were, why they said they weren't talking about it. And we know that these colorblind methods may perpetuate racism. And the reason why is because children are little scientists, they're observing that certain people are being treated differently than others, and they start to form their own attributions for why, and they might actually blame the Black child for the behavior as opposed to being able to attribute it to something like racism and systemic racism. And so an example of shielding is my child's too young to fully understand the situation. He's not ready to learn about all of the hate in the world. Passive is it just hasn't come up. And then there, of course, were parents who said, it's not important. This isn't something she needs to know right now. And as I mentioned, in contrast, by 12 or 13, the majority of children of color, Black and brown children, in many studies, it's been shown they're reporting that they've experienced racial discrimination, and they're reporting that the majority of the time that has been perpetrated by a white child. So this is an interesting contrast in that white parents are saying they don't need to learn about this hate, it's not important, while children of color are already experiencing discrimination. So we also, within this sample, were interested in individual differences. So what kinds of individual differences in parents might be predictive of their willingness to have these discussions? And in my research, I've been particularly interested in the theory of aversive racism, this idea that some white individuals are well-meaning, they may hold these egalitarian principles, but still harbor these unconscious negative attitudes and feelings and beliefs, and that this may lead to unintended negative consequences. So in my research, I've been really interested in investigating the extent to which people may be aware of these sort of unconscious negative attitudes and their potential to impact their behaviors, and the extent to which this individual difference might differentially predict people's behaviors, how they respond to experimental manipulations, et cetera. So imagine that Sarah is one of those moms, right? So you could have a Sarah who perhaps is completely unaware of the fact that stereotyping and racism would have impacted her child's behaviors. Perhaps Sarah could recognize that this bias exists and not feel particularly concerned about it. And there may be a third Sarah, right, who recognizes this bias and feels concerned. And so I sort of am proposing, and through my research, I have shown that this third Sarah may fundamentally differ than the other two in terms of the predictive validity of the measure on people's behaviors. So for this individual difference, I think it's really important to assess this because it is assessing both awareness and concern. So not just this idea that I know that I could engage in racist behaviors or my unconscious negative attitudes could impact my behaviors, but also I'm concerned about expressing that. I also think that instead of categorizing people ourselves as high and explicit, low and implicit, for example, there's something really unique and important about someone's willingness and ability to self-report that they hold these unconscious negative attitudes that may be impacting their behaviors. So just briefly, the measure is, even though I know it's not appropriate, I sometimes feel I hold unconscious negative attitudes toward Blacks. When talking to Black people, I sometimes worry that I'm unintentionally acting in a prejudiced way. Even though I like Black people, I still worry that I have unconscious biases toward Blacks. And I never worry that I may be acting in a subtly prejudiced way toward Blacks. So again, this is about awareness and concern. And it's particularly about this idea that you may have these unconscious negative attitudes that are impacting your judgments and your decision-making. And so going back to these questions of how are parents discussing race and racism with their children, I was interested in whether this individual difference might be associated with the kinds of language and the kinds of things parents were self-reporting, as well as whether they were saying they were having these conversations at all. So the questions included whether they discussed these current events related to race and racism or had discussions at all. And then among the other questions we had about them witnessing racism, discussing it with their children, we coded them for a number of different things, including acknowledgement of racism, which is more color conscious focused. So an example of a parent's comment is racism is deeply embedded in American culture. Or denial of racism. So people are dividing our nation with lies about race. So we just wanted to see if bias awareness predicted these tendencies, and in particular above and beyond other measures that might be expected to predict how parents discuss race and racism with their children and whether they do it. So we found that indeed, the likelihood of parents saying yes compared to no to discussing race and racism with their children increased as bias awareness increased. These other measures are people's internal and external motivations to respond without prejudice. So what is sort of driving this motivation? Is it because it's personally important to them versus they're concerned about how other people view them? You'll see that IMS predicts increased likelihood of saying yes compared to no. EMS decreased likelihood of saying yes compared to no. IA is interracial anxiety. FT is feeling thermometer, so how warm versus cold do you feel toward Black people? Child friends is the number of non-white friends the parent self-reported their child had. And parent friends is non-white friends of parents. Contact is a 1 to 7 scale. How often and frequently are they having contact with Black individuals? And you'll see that none of those other variables were independently predicting variance in discussing race. In terms of denial of racism, we found that bias awareness was negatively associated with denial, and the other variables were not. And then lastly, bias awareness was positively associated with acknowledging racism, as was internal motivation to respond without prejudice. I feel like I have to sneeze. Okay, I think it's gonna pass. Right, really. Okay. Okay. So in summary, bias-aware white parents were more likely to discuss race with their children, less likely to deny racism, and more likely to acknowledge racism. But a question that has sort of been looming is discussing race and racism a good thing, right? So there are researchers recently who have said, we're not necessarily saying discussing racism is a bad thing, but we're saying there's just not a lot of evidence out there testing the benefits of this. So maybe some researchers should pause in terms of recommending to parents that they have these discussions, right? And so first of all, we think that this research is showing that there are specific types of parents in general, right? Individual differences that might be associated with more color conscious styles of discussion. So parents who know how to or more likely to have these conversations. But what about, more specific evidence showing that if parents are guided to have these conversations, it might be beneficial? So just to reflect on the limitations of what I've already shared, those data were self-report, the child was not present, and these parents were sort of reflecting on how they would have discussed, race and racism with their child or what they've done in the past, right? Just coming back to what I said, research suggests that even though potentially parents should be doing this, there's little empirical evidence to support it. And even though white parents think that discussing racism is a good thing, they often fear doing it. They think that maybe they'll increase their child's biases, that they don't know what they're doing, they don't have the tools, et cetera. And so one thing I think is really important here is that, despite the fact that despite the fact that as people get older, they self-report less racial bias, right? So you see that 6-year-olds, explicit negative attitudes that they report is higher than 10-year-olds, and 10-year-olds are higher than adults. Across these different sort of cohorts, there is evidence that their implicit negative attitudes remain, right? And so the idea here is that children, as they get older, are picking up on social cues that self-reporting or outwardly expressing their negative attitudes is not something that they should be doing, right? So this is another reason why we think it's really important, especially in this 8 to 12-year-old age range, for parents and children to be having these explicit conversations, confronting the realities of racism and reflecting on the attitudes their child may be having, but also important to look at, whether these implicit negative attitudes might fluctuate as a function of having these kinds of conversations. So our first question was, can we develop a method to better facilitate conversations about race? Specifically, if we provide explicit prompts for white parents to discuss race with their children, will they actually do it if we provide them with better tools compared to previous research? And if white parents discuss race and racism with their children, will the kids actually show a reduction in their negative attitudes, right? In particular, their implicit negative attitudes. So previous research has suggested, there's no evidence to suggest this. So we in particular wanted to sort of look at pre to post discussion. Do we see reductions potentially? So we brought 83 parent-child dyads into the lab from the greater Chicago area. So these were self-identified white parents of white children, again, that 8 to 12 range. And 92% of our participants were moms. This is really complicated looking, but this is just for me to show you that we measured a lot of things, and I'm only talking about one component of these data today. Specifically, questions about health and demographics before they came into the lab. We asked a lot of questions about attitudes and parenting style when parents got into the lab, and questions about the kids' attitudes and their perceptions of their parents' parenting style. When they had a race discussion, we measured their verbal behavior, nonverbal behavior, and physiology. And then we looked at a whole host of outcomes afterward. So the important pre-post measure is the race IAT. But we also looked at things like their explicit attitudes, so perceptions of racial attitudes of their parents, intergroup empathy, and prosocial behavior of the kids. So specifically what I'm going to focus on today is change in implicit attitudes, as well as the content of the conversations that the parents and children had. Yeah, and then it's also important to note that the parents did not know that the discussion was going to be about race before they came into the lab. They just knew they were going to have a conversation with their kid. Okay. As I mentioned, parents and children were basically asked to sit down and have conversations, and we provided them with some tools to facilitate this. One set of tools we provided them with were videos, 8 videos, some that were examples of more subtle racism, some more blatant racism, and these were taken from Summers and Norton paper when they developed sort of lay theories of examples of racism as measured by the public and examples given by the public. So I'm just gonna play some videos so that you can hear that. And I'm realizing I didn't select share sound, so let me go ahead and do that. New computer. What? Okay, so if you can't hear it, let me know. Okay.
Tom feels uncomfortable around Black people. The other day, when he was interacting with Adam, he felt nervous.
Okay, could people hear that? Okay, cool. All right. That was an example. Okay, and here's an example of blatant bias.
Jamie tells her friends that they should not play with Black kids. The other day, she told Samantha not to play with Jessica.
Okay. So there are a few things that are important here. One thing that we made sure that we did is we wanted to be extremely clear about what the outcome should be or who it should be attributed to, right? As well as what was going on. So stating that a child felt uncomfortable around Black children, or they thought that kids shouldn't play with Black people, to sort of set up a situation to reduce the likelihood that parents would wiggle their way out of this and blame it on something else, right? Which has been a problem in past research. We wanted to make it super clear, why this thing was happening and who was engaging in this behavior. Okay. So before we had parents and children have these discussions, we piloted these materials with a sample of over 100 undergrads just to develop this method. And in particular, to see if we would observe variability, right, in people's responses to these videos. And we saw verbal and nonverbal variability, we saw physiological variability. And so we felt like these videos are emotionally evocative, not only potentially to get kids to talk, but also to get parents engaged in talking. And so we also sort of wanted to provide parents with scaffolding to talk about race and racism in a color conscious way. And so we tried to design some questions around this. And these prompts were theory driven, based on racial socialization and intergroup relations research, which suggests basically that parents should be mentioning race when discussing racist acts with their children. So specifically in this context of racism, right? Like not just because, again, to help children understand why this is happening. They should offer attributions for the prejudice act, so specifically attributing it to the actor as opposed to explaining in a way, right? They should encourage empathy and perspective taking with the victim of prejudice. Of course, there are mixed data out there suggesting that sometimes perspective taking can backfire, but much of the literature on how can we reduce prejudice has been centered around encouraging empathy. And lastly, that the parents should be encouraging their children to point out prejudice when they witness it, right? So that they can label it and children can understand what that looks like. And so we designed our prompts around these sort of, this sort of theory that we pulled from the literature. So the questions were, do you think that there was something wrong with Tiffany's behavior? So the example was Tiffany thinks all Black kids are dumb. The other day when the teacher wasn't looking, she called Casey stupid, right? So this is obviously a blatant, behavior. So do you think that there was something wrong with Tiffany's behavior? How do you think Tiffany's behavior made Casey feel? How would you feel if you were Casey? So empathy, perspective taking, sort of labeling whether there's something wrong and making attributions. So why do you think Tiffany did what she did? And do you think Tiffany's behavior was prejudiced? And we provided a definition. Prejudice is when someone has a negative opinion of someone because of the group they belong to. So we try to be pretty broad, right? But help them understand what that can mean. Okay. So what did we find in terms of what parents were talking about? So in general, we found that across both the subtle and the blatant conditions, parents were using racial language. So using either the terms Black, white, African American, or the word race. And when I say using racial labels, it was primarily racial groups. And so previous research had found that even if they set up situations in which they encourage parents to mention race, right, they really struggled to get parents to actually say race-related words out loud, and they were avoidant of doing that. So we were able to successfully get parents to do that at a pretty high frequency. A large percentage of parents were pointing out prejudice, right? So encouraging their child to see that particular attitudes or behaviors were prejudiced. So in the subtle condition, about 60%, the blatant condition, about 82%. There's a small percentage of parents who were connecting what was happening with societal racism. So sort of going beyond pointing out prejudice and connecting it to subtle racism. But we also found some more colorblind and negative sorts of ways of portraying what was happening. So, about 48 and 32% respectively, subtle and blatant parents were giving the white child the benefit of the doubt. So suggesting maybe it was unintentional and the child's intentions couldn't be known. Redirecting, so saying maybe this has nothing to do with race, about 13%. And a surprisingly low percentage of parents use colorblind messaging, and perhaps that has something to do with the way that we set up the prompts. So like what matters is the person inside and not a person's skin color, right? Which is a little bit confusing for children because they can see that color is mattering in this situation, right? So the parent's not really going beyond that. And then about 20% of parents were blaming some sort of external thing like the media or adults. And then about 1 to 2%, fortunately not too many, were blaming what happened on the Black child, right? Okay, so I'm just gonna provide you with some examples of what those things look like. So mentioning race could fall on either side, right? Positive or negative. So the example is Matt thinks that all Black kids look alike. He gets Alex and James mixed up all the time. And the parent who's in Black says, yeah, I guess he needed a pencil. He wanted to ask James for a pencil, but instead he asked Alex because he has a hard time. Here, sit down. That's a parent, right? Like telling their kid, like, sit in that chair. He had a hard time. He has a hard time telling Black people apart. So he knew the mistake there, I guess. So what do you think about? Do you think you've had a hard time telling Black people apart? The child says, maybe a little. And the parent says, really, why do you think that is? Right? So the parents mentioning the race of the child in the video, the parents also mentioning race in regard to any interactions their child may have had and asking them, have you had similar experiences or things that you've done? Okay, an example of pointing out prejudice, Tom feels uncomfortable around Black people. The other day when he was interacting with Adam, he felt nervous. So the parent says, do you think Tom's behavior was prejudice? Prejudice is when someone has a negative opinion of someone because of the group they belong to. The child says, no, not at all. I just think he's uncomfortable because he might have been new to Black people. And the mom makes a face and the kid goes, why? What, mom? And the mom says, well, like, does it matter? The child says, no, it doesn't matter. If he's feeling a little nervous, and she says, okay, it's okay to be nervous about different people. But if the only reason is because they look different, and then the child says, I don't think. And then the mom says, what if Teo was nervous around you because you look different than her? How would that make you feel? The child says, I think a little disappointed. And the mom says, now you see. He says, now I see. Okay, so, the mom is helping the child understand, right, that actually something prejudice did occur, right? Like, it's okay to feel nervous, but not because this person comes from a different social group. right? Alone. All right. So here's one of those examples of a parent making a connection to societal racism. Again, only about 5% of parents did this. It's a long quote. So the parent says, so his behavior was prejudiced, and child says, yeah. And the parent says, and not only that, it was violent. And then they watch it again. The parent says, sometimes in our society, white people do hurt Black people. And the child says, yeah. And the parent says, it makes me sad. The child says, me too. The parent says, like sometimes, you know how sometimes the police are more likely to shoot a teenager if it's a Black boy, even if he's doing nothing wrong. So it's actually kind of dangerous to be a Black boy in our society. So, you know, they're sort of thinking, okay, the video is moving forward, but they keep talking about it. The parent goes on to say, how do you think, if you had a Black son, how do you think they'd be treated? How would you, you know, talk to them to let them know they're okay? And the child says they would tell them they're still good. The parent asks, how do you think society would treat them? And, you know, the parent basically goes on to say, you know, here are some Black friends you have at school, and people might be prejudiced against them, right? Because they are Black, even though they are good people, essentially. So the parent basically is trying to not only say that there is societal racism, but also trying to get the kid to put themselves in the shoes of a Black person or even a Black parent if this were to happen to their child. Okay. So here's an example of a parent giving a white child the benefit of the doubt. So Tom feels uncomfortable around Black people. He felt nervous around Adam. So the mom says, why do you think Tom did what he did? And then the child says, well, maybe he has some history. Like the parent says, yeah, he has something on him. And then the child says, because he was like a teammate and they bullied him or something. Yeah, and the child says, I don't think. And the mom says, maybe he's just nervous around other people, like in general, but we don't know specifically. And the child says, no, it said Black people. And she says, the video said Black people, but he didn't ever say anything in the video, right? So the video is pretty explicit in that Tom feels uncomfortable around Black people, right? And the kid's like, the video said Black people, mom. But she's saying, hey, the kid themselves didn't say this. Maybe something happened in the past to lead to this. So this is an example of a parent giving the white child the benefit of the doubt. Here's an example of redirecting. So do you think Nathan's behavior was prejudiced? The child says yes. And the parent says, okay, let me ask you something. Could a kid be getting picked on by a kid? Could a white kid pick on a Black kid without it being a race issue? Could it be about that person? The kid says, yes, some people are just that way. Okay, and then the child says they might also pick on white kids, right? And so even though, again, the prompt is saying that Nathan is mean to Black children specifically, the mom says maybe this isn't even a race issue, right? Okay. So colorblind is pretty straightforward. You know, you can be white and a troublemaker, Black and a troublemaker. I don't think it makes a difference what your skin color is, right? So, which is sort of outside of the intended sort of discussion of this prompt, right? In terms of is prejudice occurring? And then here's that unfortunate example of blaming the Black child. So, but the other boy, Jacob, a super friendly kid, and he never did anything wrong. And then the kid says, yeah, but Jacob could have been a super duper. And then the mom says, I mean, there could have been a time Jacob did take something from somebody else, possibly. And the kid says, maybe because he found it on the ground and he thought it was his. Parent says, that's true too. But the kid's trying to sort of say, well, maybe you did it, but it was by accident, right? But the mom's kind of saying, well, Jacob could have stolen something before, right? Which is kind of blaming the situation on the Black child potentially. And then the parent who's blaming adults or media, maybe he just sees stuff on YouTube, or maybe he sees it in real life, right? Etc. Like, how did he learn that? Maybe from his parents, he overheard it. And then the kid says something about YouTube, actually. Okay, so obviously I've shown you some examples that if we provide these prompts, parents and children have these conversations, right? But this question of, is this helpful, right? Are there possibly some benefits to having these conversations still remains in terms of anti-Black attitudes. So recall that I said that we were particularly interested in implicit negative attitudes, and that we measured these attitudes before conversation and after, and we wanted to see if there were potentially some shifts in the child's attitudes after the conversation, right? Okay. So we measured implicit and explicit attitudes, implicit attitudes pre and post for both the parent and the child via a child-specific and a parent-specific IET. And the first thing we wanted to know is just whether kids and parents' implicit attitudes were correlated pre and post. And so we found that before the conversation, parents and children's implicit attitudes actually were not correlated, which is consistent with previous research, actually. However, after the conversation, they were significantly correlated at about 0.3. And when we look at these data points, we find that parents' pre and post attitudes are still correlated with one another, whereas kids' pre and post attitudes are no longer correlated, and now they're correlated with their parents. So if you look at these dots and where they move around, kids are sort of synchronizing with or more aligning more with their parents' attitudes. Okay. So the other question, do we see attitude change? So we did find that the D scores on the IAT decreased pre to post conversation. So you'll see that parents' D scores decreased from 0.5 to 0.38. But there was an even larger effect for kids where it went from 0.4 to 0.16. So what's interesting is that James Ray and Christina Olson have some data looking at the same age range, looking at the same amount of time apart, about 2 hours apart, first measure, second measure. And they find that on average, kids, white children in that age range have a D score of about 0.4. So our sample is pretty consistent with the effect size that they tend to find as well when taken 2 hours apart, right? When you're not having any sort of thing occur in the middle, right? But we find that there is a significant decrease post-conversation, and it's getting close to 0, right? Which is basically little to no preference for either group, that D score. Okay, so if we provide parents with these explicit prompts, will they discuss race with their children at higher rates than previously observed? So yes, we found higher rates of discussion. If they have these discussions, might it potentially be associated with attitude change? We did see some reductions in these attitudes, right? But we can talk a little bit more about the impact or the effect of that. And then we found that on average, all of our families actually were talking, right? And around 67 to 77%, depending on the subtle or blatant mentioned race. And 61 to 83% pointed out prejudice, whereas about 5 to 10% has been observed in previous lab studies. So we conclude here that these guided color conscious family discussions show promise for reducing racial biases in multiple generations at once. But some limitations, right? We did not have a true control group. We did a pre-post measure. And even though, as I said before, there's some previous research by James Ray and Christina Olson showing that, if you take 2 measures of implicit attitudes across the same time period twice, similar age range, there is no significant decrease, right? And our data show something different. It's still possible, right, that something else was going on that reduced their attitudes beyond the discussion. Another thing that's important in terms of limitations is our study in particular provided these color conscious prompts to facilitate conversation, right? So we're not sort of arguing that any conversation, that if you just get parents to talk, full stop, that that's beneficial. We're not saying that all parents are well-meaning, right? So we observed parents who were blaming the Black child, blaming other things, giving the white child the benefit of the doubt. We're also not saying that overtly racist discussions would be beneficial, right? So if parents are saying things that are racist or negative within the context of the conversation, even if they are provided with color conscious prompts, we do not believe that this would be beneficial to the child and lead to reductions in their negative attitudes, right? So that's really important. So in future directions, we want to investigate whether parents engaging with their child in the context of a semi-structured race discussion task impacts their longer term behavior and willingness to engage with their child in the topic of race. We also want to have an intervention with the true control group. So this could look like an empty control, right, where they just take the measures. It also could be a control in which we provide them with the videos, but we don't provide them with prompts, right, to see if there's specifically something about those structured prompts that are theoretically based, right, that is facilitating this color conscious type of conversation, and perhaps in particular benefiting parents and children after their discussion. Okay, thank you so much for attending the talk and listening. I want to thank my former postdoc, who's now an assistant professor at UGA, Allison Skinner, my graduate student, James Wages, who will be defending his dissertation any day now, and starting a faculty position at the University of Central Arkansas. Emily Blevins, who's at UIUC, a graduate student who helped us out. Jamie Abide, my former colleague at the University of Vermont. Sarah Waters, who's at Washington State University, an assistant professor there, as well as the rest of my lab for contributing to helping us collect all of these data over the last 3 years. All right, thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Sylvia. While we're waiting for questions, I'll ask the first one. I guess this question is maybe not relevant because it deals with younger kids, but here goes. So I was at the library, like any parent, I'm like, oh, let's ground on my experience. I was at the library the other day with my 4-year-old, and there was a whole shelf of books, Peppa Pig, and then next to that was like about like the Hiroshima atomic bomb and something about Auschwitz. And so I was like, you know, it seems too young for a 4-year-old to teach a 4-year-old about like genocide, for instance. And I realized that there's this like an inherent aversion to teaching kids about evil. And so certainly there's something like very special about race, especially in America. And I'm wondering if you can think of like just kind of ponder how much do you think that effects are due to like there's evil in general, right? Like you don't want to tell people that some people are just evil, and then there's like kind of group-based evil, and then like your group-based evil with social implications today. So any thoughts on kind of like this continuum or evil or anything?
Okay, I'm trying to unpack that. So your question is in terms of where the effect lies. It's about like what kinds of attributions are people making? Is it about evil people in general, the group?
Yeah, so I guess to be a little more concrete, yeah, so you could imagine that there's aversions to parents at all sorts of different stages, right? The kind of most obvious being about race in particular in this kind of as Americans and in this moment. And then, but there's also some kind of aversions about just telling your kid that people are terrible.
Oh, I see.
And they just do terrible things to each other.
Yeah.
So is there a kind of great, and race in particular, when you're talking white parents, it's like, well, you could be bad, like little Jimmy, you know?
Yeah, sure. So I think I have a few thoughts. One, there are like age appropriate ways to discuss, you know, these things, right? So I think that when kids are younger, first of all, introducing them to the idea that even though they might observe differences in the world, that there are positive attributes, there is beauty in everything, right? Even if these things look different. So, you know, this is one of the things that Black parents do to sort of counter prejudice with their children, letting them know that your skin is beautiful, just like anyone else's, right? Because if children are constantly getting examples on TV and so forth, that like some people are to be valued more than others, then that as a baseline for a 3 or 4-year-old, right? I do think that 3 or 4-year-olds, right, understand the idea. Are you still there? Where did you go? Okay, I think all the hand raising is pushing you. Okay, I do think 3 and 4-year-olds understand the idea of like good behaviors and bad behaviors. One thing that I try not to do with my 3-year-old is to say, like, I really hate when he talks about bad guys and good guys, right? Because it essentializes something. And I really think that what we're talking about is the behavior, as well as how they understand fairness as well. The idea that something may have been set up, right, that's unfair, that's harming people because they're different, right? And so I think that there are ways that you can talk about fairness, about individual behaviors not being okay and harmful in a way that doesn't have to be about death and mass murder. Right? So even when you talk, so obviously with Michael Brown and Black Lives Matter movement and so forth, we're talking about 8 to 12-year-olds because, police violence and things like that, not something that a 3-year-old can fully understand. A 3-year-old can understand that someone was mean to someone because they look different, because their skin was brown. You know what I mean? They understand already. I know my son does that. People are being treated differently because of how they look, and that's not so nice and that's not fair, right? So I think that you have to sort of look to this idea of like, how would you talk to your children about COVID, or you know what I mean, if they're 3 versus if they're 8 and so forth. And yeah, I think this idea of inherent evil, right? It goes back to sort of like some of the like early prejudice talk, from Gordon Allport or whatever, this idea that there's like a prejudiced personality and that people who have authoritarian parents are more likely to be evil and become racist, as opposed to this idea that there are systems that are set up all around us that benefit some people and are more harmful to others. And what can we do, right, to counter that and to help our children understand how to be advocates and to counter that, if that makes sense? Because kids care about fairness, right, a lot. So yeah, does that help? Is that like consistent with what you were thinking?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, are you asking Kurt what his definition of evil is?
What?
Or me?
No, I was asking you.
What my definition of evil is? I think if we're talking about an individual, I feel like it's like an essentializing kind of thing. Like there's something to the core about this person that is just bad. Or, this particular, it could be something that like there is intended harm. I feel like there's like a moral component to it. But like, I don't know, I'm just sort of like just riffing off of my gut reaction of what I think about as evil. And like this idea of like angels and hell and like I just feel like within the context of the US, right, and having been raised in the South, that's what I think of when I think about evil. But what are you thinking about, Sarah?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I don't think that children have the capacity to conceptualize evil until like at least age 12. And so I don't think that they have the capacity to understand good and bad behaviors, like in that broader context of evil versus good. I think like since they have such egocentric thinking at that age, like it all kind of relates back to themselves, like actions. And so I think, I don't know, I think trying to approach the situation by like explaining behaviors or like attitudes as evil to a child of an age like below 12 is just more confusing, honestly.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think if you are to include evil in any kind of conversation, I think there needs to be really clear like distinctions as to what evil is, because evil is not something that's just like in like can be understood on an individual basis. Like if evil is a real concept, then it needs to have definitions. And especially if you are to like be explaining something like that to a child who doesn't really have the like cognitive capacity to understand something that broad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Like I think that younger children can understand not so nice and and nice. I think they can understand fairness, but evil's nuance. I can barely define evil.
But they understand all of those things like in the context of
Sarah, I don't want
their own reaction.
Have us go down the road of good and evil, like the fundamental moral primitives. When there's lots of folks in the queue to ask Sylvia questions, so maybe we can continue in a little bit. But this is the ultimate question, obviously. What is evil? And so, Sylvia, I'll let you. Yeah, no worries, Sarah. Or I can do it. It seemed like Caitlin and Ramal had their hands up first, so maybe we can go you two folks first, and then go from there.
Okay.
Sure, I can go. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Caitlin.
Great talk. I was just wondering, I kind of noticed in both of the subtle and blatant conditions that you had that it seemed like parents, any given parent might have been mentioning both kind of race conscious and more colorblind language. And I was wondering how often you saw that and what you think that might reflect.
Yeah. Oh man. I'm trying to pull up the manuscript to see if the mixed messages data are in this particular manuscript. I think it's in the supplement. So this kind of mixed messaging is relatively common, especially across different contexts. In one of our papers, but that's with adolescents, I think we find about a third of parents are using these mixed messages, sometimes within the same example, right? They're using comments that suggest that race doesn't matter, while also, saying something that's more color conscious. And the argument we're making is that this can be confusing for children and sometimes undermine what the parents intend when they're trying to, have these conversations. And I think one part of it is that I do think that, like, fundamentally, a lot of, white people are taught that talking about things in a colorblind way is the best way to do it, right? That is the most helpful. And so I think that at the core, some people may just tend to, right, like, want to say that first, and then perhaps shift to some other example or whatever. But I would have to get back to you about the exact percentage of parents who use mixed messages in this sample. We thought that for that particular paper, it would have just really complicated things to outline that, but I'm also happy to send you a preprint of another paper where we talk about mixed messages specifically.
Yeah, that makes sense. It also makes me think about what you said about your prompts and how important they are, that it could help people who are typically used to talking about more colorblind messaging, could help them kind of lean away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, was Ramon?
Yeah, I think it was me that was up next. Yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. And the question that I had was just, I think you mentioned at some point that you collected demographic data about the parents and things like that. So what I was curious about was if you collected any data in regards to, for example, political party affiliation or socioeconomic status, and what the associations were, such as are parents that identify as liberal more likely to use this sort of messaging, or people in the socioeconomic bracket more likely to use this sort of messaging?
Well, what I can't necessarily say is whether there is a correlation between them, because overwhelmingly our sample was liberal and high SES. So let's see, 66% were liberal to liberal leaning, 19% moderate, 15% conservative. So with the sample of 87, right, it's there are very few conservatives. 95% reported they were married. 78% reported a household income over 100,000. 40% held a bachelor's degree. 35% held a graduate degree. Right. And so I think it's also it's important with these studies and a lot of developmental studies to think about which parents are cool with bringing their kid into the lab for a 2-hour study. And I know, at least when I was at Yale and I worked with, I sort of observed some stuff that was going on in Christina Olson's lab. It was ooh, I'm going to take my kid to Yale, maybe, So I do think that the sample is pretty progressive on average. I think they probably lean toward the kind of parent who wants to raise an anti-racist child, right? And I think that, they are much different, right, than a sample who might be more likely to push back on that and be perhaps less progressive potentially. So I can't really speak to what that predicts necessarily, but I can say that our sample was overwhelmingly higher SES, well-educated, and liberal.
I'm not sure who's next now. So.
I'll just pick Chase.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Something that definitely piqued my interest, especially when you were talking with Sarah earlier about essentialism, and you touched on that a bit in your presentation as well, is I've seen a big debate, especially in cases regarding this sort of talking about racism and prejudice, where there needs to be this or even there might not need to be, some people might see this as a contradiction, where we both talk about how racism and prejudice and stuff like that isn't the product of singular people or singular, like, quote unquote, evil actions, and is part of a system. But at the same time, it's irredeemable, it's incorrigible, and it's something that, like, there's some people who say, how do we like fault specific people for engaging in racist actions when we also see it as there being this sort of a system that sort of directly by design imparts it on people. And that sort of, conflict that sometimes is observed between, individual action and it being part of this wider system. Could you talk about that a bit, and whether there's any sort of theoretical backing to how you align that with your work? I'm sorry if that's a little complex.
No, it is complex, and I feel like I could teach a whole class on this. So obviously, in many ways, I study individual level prejudice, but I also think about the fact that informing people about systemic racism, as like theorized and shown by previous research, including some work that Caitlin's advisor, Courtney Bonham, has done, former advisor, this idea that when people are exposed to information about systemic racism, right, that helps them understand the potential impact of their own individual level racism. I also sort of am interested in and think the theory of like the bias of crowds, right, that Keith Payne sort of puts forth is an important theory to think about, in that you have these individual level prejudices. They might fluctuate, but the context in which people are in can really shape how those attitudes fluctuate, and perhaps also the behaviors that manifest. And so, for example, in my research with medical students, we found that when students are observing examples of racism, so discrimination, the attending physicians are engaging in more racial discrimination. They themselves develop more negative attitudes and show sort of worse patient care for patients of color. And so I think that these are obviously, there are individual acts, right, that are occurring. And this death by 1,000 cuts, microaggressions that are daily happening that are impacting Black people's physiological responses and their health, right? But there are also systems that are set up that even if we lived in a world in which every single individual was nice to us, right? These systems are set up such that it's more difficult for people to get ahead, right? Because of their racial group. So I think that it's nuanced. I think that both parts are important. And I think when it comes to white individuals, I think about, this Beverly Tatum quote where she talks about, if there's an escalator that's going in one direction, you can't just ride it. You have to turn around and move in the opposite direction. You have to actually actively push back against racism and systemic racism. Just not being racist in and of itself isn't enough. What behaviors and actions can you engage in to push back against a system that is racist, right? And how can you be an ally to push back against that system? And I think it takes people engaging in some behaviors that they may not be comfortable with, or shifting their mindset about what systemic racism is. I also think that Heather McGee's book, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Oh gosh, I've been listening to it on Audible, so I'm going to tell you about it. She's this really interesting author. She's an economist, and she tells the story, right, about how all of these public pools closed down just simply because white people didn't want to swim with Black people when integration happened. So like something that negatively impacts everyone. It's called the sum of us. So this idea that like certain policies are put into place that supposedly are about everyone, but really are racist policies, right? And they negatively impact us all. So that was kind of like I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I think about it. It's nuanced. Oh yeah, that's yeah. I don't know if it's Italia or yeah, but I agree. The system needs active participants in order to function. Yeah.
All right, sensitive to the time. Sylvia, if you have time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, I do. Lucky for me, I don't have anything else today except for writing. So yeah, let's see, maybe Rayhan?
Yeah, hi there. Great talk. So my question is about what you mentioned early on in the talk, about the sort of like aversive responses and reluctance in talking about race and those unconscious accompanying attitudes. And when you mentioned those sort of reactions, my mind went straight to emotional regulation, such as, through cognitive reappraisal or some way to foster an ability to talk about race despite an initial aversion. So I was wondering if you had a familiarity or an opinion on if emotional regulation could play a role here, and maybe in contrast to the intervention of like setting it up or putting the responsibility on how we, talk about the reality of the issue.
Yeah, so there is some work on cognitive reappraisals and how in appraising sort of these situations as a challenge versus a threat can be beneficial in interracial interaction. So there is some cognitive reappraisal work showing that. There's some work showing that if you encourage people to engage in loving kindness or mindfulness meditation, that it can lead to more fruitful interracial interactions. So the idea is that they're, better able, like less focused on themselves, right? And there's less of a barrier there to have successful conversation. So my postdoc, who just started with me this past academic year, some work that she's doing is trying to sort of apply some cognitive behavioral therapy research. So manipulations in that regard to people sitting with negative emotion. So instead of telling people to reappraise it, right, that negative emotion is okay, it's okay to feel uncomfortable and to sit with that. Because I think a lot of times in this research that people are really focused on reducing anxiety, but it turns out discussing race and racism, especially right now, is anxiety provoking, right? And so how can we instead get people to sit with the discomfort of feeling uncomfortable, right, of this anxiety when they're having these conversations, so they're less focused on themselves and better able to focus on their partner and their needs. And then lastly, I will say that when I ran that study with the undergrads using those methods where they're watching the videos and so forth, I found that this personal awareness, that bias awareness, was associated with the comfort that they were having discussing or talking about these racist acts out loud. So they showed more nonverbal confidence. They showed less verbal hesitancy as measured by Luke. So the number of nonverbal tics, the ums, the uhs, the pauses, the I'm not sure. And they were less likely to do things like give the white child the benefit of the doubt, right? So this idea that like, if I'm bias aware, right, both in my sort of nonverbal responses, as well as sort of my vocalics and the way that I talk, I'm displaying more confidence when talking about racism. And my sort of theoretical argument there is that if you've had a chance to reflect on your own racism, you're more likely to see it out in the world, you're more comfortable with discussing it with other people. When you're talking about it out loud, right, you're just more comfortable with it because of the idea that like, that you're more comfortable with the idea that this thing can exist, right? And that you too can be a part of it.
All right. Thank you so much, Sylvia, for coming and talking with us today. If she didn't get your question, we now know that Sylvia has nothing to do this afternoon, so maybe you can, you can email her and interrupt
absolutely nothing.
Her writing time, and she already has tenure. Yay! So she doesn't need to publish anything ever again. All right.
What's your excuse, Kurt?
Yeah, no excuse. Let's give Sylvia one more hand. We have another talk next week, so stay tuned for an announcement for that. Nick is going to post. Has already a couple talks on the website, and we'll post Sylvia's talk soon. And for those of you in the class, have fun today. And for everyone else, hopefully we will see you next week. So thanks for coming, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you soon.